The village of Little Denscombe lay folded into the gentle Hampshire countryside, like a pressed flower between the pages of an old family Bible. Its thatched cottages leaned companionably towards one another along the winding high street, their gardens trimmed but not fussy, roses climbing with the quiet assurance of long habitation. Beyond the village greenware ducks waddled with proprietary air, and a war memorial stood in dignified silence rose the square grey tower of St. Jude's Church. St. Jude's had stood for 6 centuries. Its stonework bore the softened edges of time. Its yew trees crouched in the churchyard like ancient sentinels, casting long shadows that crept across crooked headstones. The church was neither grand nor insignificant, it was simply there, steady and enduring, the heart of village life. It was on a mild September morning, the air brushed with the first hint of autumn, that Miss Jane Marple arrived in Little Denscombe. She came not as an investigator, but as a guest. Miss Marple had accepted an invitation from her old acquaintance, Mrs. Eleanor Price, who had recently retired to Little Denscombe after the death of her husband. Eleanor Price, formerly of St. Mary Mead, had written in a firm, slightly tremulous hand, "My dear Jane, you must come and see our harvest festival at St. Jude's. It is quite the event here. The flower arrangements are absurdly competitive, and the vicar's wife believes herself a born impresario. I feel certain you would find it diverting." Miss Marple always found village life diverting. She arrived with one modest suitcase, her knitting bag, and the serene air of a woman who noticed far more than anyone suspected. The harvest preparations St. Jude's was in a state of industrious bustle. Inside, the nave smelled of beeswax and chrysanthemums. Sheaves of golden wheat were tied in careful bundles at the ends of pews. Baskets of apples, marrows, and cabbages stood arranged before the altar in symmetrical pride. Sunlight filtered through stained glass, casting jewel-toned patches across the flagstones. At the centre of it all was Mrs. Lydia Harcourt, the vicar's wife. Mrs. Harcourt was a tall, commanding woman with iron-grey hair, swept into a formidable chignon. She wore a navy dress buttoned to the throat and carried a clipboard as though it were a military instrument. She issued instructions in crisp tones that brooked no argument. "Not there, Mr. Pettigrew, good gracious, the dahlias will clash dreadfully with the altar frontal. Move them to the font, yes, the other side." Miss Marple, seated quietly in a pew beside Mrs. Price, observed this with mild interest. "The general in her campaign," she murmured gently. Mrs. Price suppressed a laugh. "You've not changed, Jane." "People seldom do," Miss Marple replied. "They merely rearrange themselves." There were several others at work within the church that morning. Mr. Arthur Pettigrew, the church warden, stooped and pink-cheeked, handled flowers as though they were delicate explosives. He perspired readily and apologized often. Miss Beatrice Lane, the organist, slight and pale, hovered near the vestry door with a distracted air. She wore a soft green cardigan and spectacles that slid repeatedly down her nose. There was something faintly anxious about her movements. Captain Hugh Beresford, retired, moustachioned, and impeccably upright, stood by the lectern discussing hymn selections with the vicar, Reverend Simon Harcourt. The vicar himself was a gentle man in his early 40s, scholarly in appearance, with thoughtful eyes and hands that moved as though shaping invisible arguments. He smiled frequently, though that morning there seemed a faint tightness about it. "Harvest is a celebration of provision," he was saying earnestly to Captain Beresford, "of gratitude." "Community not quite so," said the captain briskly, "though community can be a dashed awkward thing at times." Miss Marple's gaze lingered on that exchange. The vestry at St. Jude's was a modest chamber off the north side of the chancel. It contained a heavy oak table, a cupboard for vestments, shelves stacked with hymnals, and a small iron safe built into the wall. The single narrow window overlooked the churchyard. It was here that certain parish records were kept and the modest sum collected weekly for charitable works. More importantly, it was here that something curious would soon occur. A subtle unease that afternoon, Miss Marple accompanied Mrs. Price to tea at the vicarage, a red brick house partly concealed by overgrown ivy. The drawing-room bore evidence of Mrs. Harcourt's tidy authority. Antimacassars placed with geometric precision, silver polished to an unkind gleam. Conversation flowed politely enough. Captain Beresford spoke of India and the war years. Mr. Pettigrew worried about the flower competition judging. Miss Lane sipped tea in nervous silence. Yet beneath the genteel surface, Miss Marple sensed currents. Mrs. Harcourt directed her husband's remarks with small interruptions. "My dear Simon, you mustn't forget to mention the diocesan inspection next month." The vicar inclined his head. "Yes, Lydia." Captain Beresford's moustache twitched faintly at that. Later, when the conversation fractured into smaller clusters, Miss Marple found herself beside Miss Lane. "You play the organ beautifully," Miss Marple observed kindly. Miss Lane started slightly. "Oh, thank you. It's only practice. Practice reveals character," Miss Marple said softly. Miss Lane's fingers tightened on her teacup. "You are very perceptive, Miss Marple." A flicker crossed Miss Lane's face, recognition perhaps, or apprehension. "Ow!" Miss Marple smiled benignly. The inciting incident, the harvest festival, dawned bright and crisp. Villagers filled the church in their Sunday best. Children whispered. The scent of polished wood and ripe fruit mingled pleasantly. The choir sang with earnest enthusiasm. The service proceeded without mishap. Reverend Harcourt delivered a sermon on stewardship and hidden blessings. His voice echoed gently beneath the stone arches. Then came the closing hymn. During its final verse, Mrs. Harcourt slipped discreetly from her pew and moved towards the vestry, no doubt to ensure all was prepared for post-service arrangements. Moments later, the hymn concluded. There followed a sound that did not belong to any harvest celebration. A scream, sharp, piercing, unmistakably horrified. The congregation froze. Captain Beresford was first to move. He strode briskly towards the vestry door, followed by the vicar. The door was closed. Mrs. Harcourt's voice, trembling now, came from within. "Simon, Simon." The vicar tried the handle. It would not turn. "It's locked," he said, confusion entering his tone. "Stand aside," Captain Beresford ordered, testing the handle himself. Solid, firm. "Miss Harcourt," called the vicar urgently. "What is it?" Her reply came broken. "Hessie's on the floor, Arthur." A ripple of alarm swept through the church. Arthur Pettigrew, the churchwarden. Miss Marple rose quietly from her seat. The vestry door was sturdy oak, fitted with a brass handle and keyhole. The key, as it happened, was not visible on the exterior side. "Is there another entrance?" Captain Beresford demanded. "No," said the vicar. "Only the window, but it's narrow, and latched from within," Mrs. Harcourt cried. Captain Beresford wasted no more time. He summoned 2 sturdy farmers from the congregation. Together, they rammed the door with their shoulders. It resisted once, twice. On the third attempt, the lock splintered and the door flew inward. The vestry lay in disarray, and upon the flagstone floor, near the oak table, lay Mr. Arthur Pettigrew. He was on his side, spectacles askew, one hand outstretched, as though reaching for something unseen. Mrs. Harcourt stood near the wall, pale and trembling. The window above the table was indeed latched. The only door, the one now hanging crooked on broken hinges, had been locked from within. Captain Beresford knelt beside Pettigrew and felt for a pulse. His expression changed. "He's gone," he said quietly. A hush fell, thick and unnatural. Reverend Harcourt stared down at the body of his churchwarden, his face drained of colour. "But how?" he whispered. Miss Marple, who had stepped forward with surprising steadiness for a woman of her years, took in the scene with mild, attentive eyes. The safe in the wall stood closed. The oak table held parish ledgers. And on the table, beside an open leather-bound register, rested a small silver communion cup. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on that cup. She bent slightly, not touching, merely observing. Then she straightened. "How very unfortunate," she murmured almost to herself. The first questions the village constable arrived within the half-hour, flustered and officious. Dr. Mallory was summoned from his surgery and confirmed what Captain Beresford had already suspected: heart failure. Most. "Likely," the doctor said. "Though rather sudden. Could it have been a fall?" asked the vicar weakly. "There's no obvious injury." Miss Marple's eyes drifted again to the silver communion cup. "Was Mr. Pettigrew alone in here?" she asked gently. Mrs. Harcourt pressed a handkerchief to her lips. I came in to fetch the collection totals. I found him like that. The door was closed. I assumed he had stepped out momentarily and pulled it shut, but when I saw you locked it," Captain Beresford asked sharply. "No, certainly not." The vicar frowned. Arthur often locked the vestry when counting money. Constable Briggs cleared his throat. "But if it were locked from inside, sir?" A silence followed. "Locked. Window latched. No sign of struggle. Mr. Pettigrew dead." Miss Marple folded her gloved hands neatly. "A puzzle," she said softly. And though no one yet understood it, little Denscombe had just acquired a mystery that would disturb its tranquil facade and reveal the small, dangerous secrets beating beneath its polite heart. Miss Marple glanced once more at the broken lock, the silver cup, and the faces gathered in strained bewilderment. Then she smiled faintly. Village life, she reflected, was so very instructive. The news travelled through Little Denscombe with remarkable efficiency. By Monday morning, curtains twitched more frequently than usual, and conversations paused when footsteps approached. Mr. Arthur Pettigrew had been churchwarden for nearly 20 years. He had christened infants, arranged funerals, balanced parish accounts with meticulous care, and once personally repaired a cracked pew with admirable devotion. To discover him lifeless on the vestry floor behind a locked door was not merely tragic, it was unsettling. And in villages, what unsettles is far more dangerous than what merely grieves. The official verdict and doubt Dr. Mallory conducted a discreet examination at the surgery the following afternoon. The preliminary conclusion was cautiously expressed. "There are indications consistent with heart failure," he informed the vicar and Constable Briggs. "However," he hesitated. "However?" prompted Captain Beresford, who had insisted on attending. "There are faint traces of digitalis in the bloodstream." The word fell like a pebble into still water. "Digitalis," repeated the vicar blankly. "A heart stimulant," said the captain sharply. "Derived from foxglove," Dr. Mallory nodded. "In small doses, medicinal. In excess, dangerous." Constable Briggs shifted uncomfortably. "Are you saying someone poisoned him?" "I am saying," Dr. Mallory replied carefully, "that Mr. Pettigrew ingested more digitalis than would be therapeutically advisable." "And how would he have done that?" asked the vicar faintly. "That," said the doctor, "is precisely the question. Miss Marple observes Miss Marple received this information later that evening over tea at Mrs. Price's cottage." "Poison," breathed Mrs. Price. "In the vestry." Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. "Foxglove grows quite prettily along cottage fences," she remarked. "One must be careful with such attractive plants. They can be so deceptive. You think it was deliberate?" "My dear Eleanor," Miss Marple said gently, "when a man dies behind a locked door, one must assume someone took trouble. But how? The vestry was locked from the inside." "Yes," said Miss Marple softly. "That is the interesting part." She set down her cup. "In my experience, locked rooms rarely remain so by magic. They are arranged." The vestry revisited Constable Briggs, eager, though somewhat out of his depth, permitted Miss Marple to accompany Mrs. Price to St. Jude's the following morning for the purpose of gathering hymn books. As he put it, the vestry had been tidied, though the broken lock remained as silent testimony. A temporary bolt had been fitted. Miss Marple moved about with unassuming delicacy. The oak table, the safe, the narrow window. She examined the latch, simple, sturdy, functional. "No marks of tampering," Constable Briggs said earnestly. Miss Marple nodded. "And the key?" she asked. "Found on the floor near Mr. Pettigrew's hand. R." She paused at the silver communion cup. "Was this tested?" she inquired mildly. "Yes, miss. No residue detected." "How thorough." Her eyes travelled to the shelves where hymnals were stacked. One lay slightly askew. She adjusted it absently. "One finds," she said conversationally, "that people in villages are very much like books on a shelf. They appear orderly at first glance, but look closely, and one often notices which volume has been disturbed." Constable Briggs blinked uncertainly. The suspects emerged. Little Denscombe had no shortage of potential motives once one looked beyond Sunday smiles. 1. Mrs. Lydia Harcourt. It was widely known that Mrs. Harcourt managed parish affairs with formidable control. Mr. Pettigrew, as churchwarden, had occasionally challenged her decisions regarding charitable disbursements. Only a fortnight earlier, raised voices had reportedly been heard from the vestry after a committee meeting. "She does not like opposition," observed Mrs. Price. Miss Marple said nothing, but her eyes were thoughtful. 2. Reverend Simon Harcourt, gentle though he appeared, the vicar had recently faced diocesan scrutiny. Parish funds were under review. Mr. Pettigrew had sole oversight of certain ledgers. Money can make even the mildest man anxious, Miss Marple remarked. 3. Miss Beatrice Lane the organist lived alone in a small tied cottage near the churchyard. It had emerged through quiet inquiry that she had once worked as a nurse before nervous exhaustion curtailed her career. Nurses know medicines, Captain Bedsford pointed out grimly. And dosages, Miss Marple added softly. 4. Captain Hugh Beresford respected, decisive, accustomed to command. But he had recently proposed a rather ambitious restoration project for St. Jude's Tower, one that required significant funds. Mr. Pettigrew had reportedly objected to reallocating charitable reserves. Men of action, Miss Marple reflected, sometimes resent obstruction. 5. Mrs. Eleanor Price, though dear to Miss Marple, Mrs. Price herself had once relied upon Mr. Pettigrew's financial advice following her husband's death. Village finances, it seemed, wove threads through many lives. Miss Marple did not exclude anyone. She never did. Interviews begin. Constable Briggs conducted formal questioning, though it quickly became evident that Miss Marple's informal conversations yielded far richer insights. With Mrs. Harcourt, the vicarage drawing-room was immaculate as ever. Mrs. Harcourt sat upright, composed though pale. "I found him lying there," she said firmly. "The door was closed but not locked when I entered. Yet it was locked when others attempted entry," Miss Marple observed gently. Mrs. Harcourt's eyes flashed. "I cannot account for that. I did not lock it. You and Mr. Pettigrew disagreed recently. A minor accounting matter, concerning." Mrs. Harcourt's jaw tightened. The allocation of certain parish funds. He was unnecessarily rigid. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Rigid men often conceal flexible fears. "I beg your pardon. Nothing at all." With Reverend Harcourt, the vicar's study smelled faintly of pipe tobacco and old paper. "Arthur was my friend," he insisted quietly. "He would never have harmed himself." "Was he troubled?" asked Miss Marple. He had seemed preoccupied, as though something weighed upon him. "Did he confide in you?" A pause. "No." Miss Marple noted the hesitation. With Miss Lane's cottage was neat but sparse. Foxgloves grew along the fence in cheerful purple spires. "How pretty," said Miss Marple. "Yes," Miss Lane replied faintly. "They thrive in poor soil." They sat opposite one another at a small table. "You were near the vestry during the service," Miss Marple said gently. "I always am. I prepare the postlude. Did you see anyone enter before Mrs. Harcourt?" Miss Lane hesitated. "I know." Her fingers trembled slightly. "You were once a nurse," Miss Marple said. Miss Lane's head lifted sharply. "For a short time. You must know a great deal about digitalis. It is hardly uncommon knowledge. Quite so." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "Nervous strain can be very difficult, my dear. Secrets are heavier still." Miss Lane's eyes filled suddenly with tears. "I have nothing to do with this," she whispered. "I am sure you believe that." A disturbing discovery 2 days later, Constable Briggs made an unsettling announcement. A page was missing from the parish ledger. Specifically, the page detailing charitable distributions for the past 6 months. "Torn cleanly," he said. "Removed, and Mr. Pettigrew managed those accounts?" Captain Bedsford asked. "Yes." Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly. "A missing page," she murmured, "like a missing stitch in lacework. One might not notice at first, but the pattern unravels. You think it's connected?" Mrs. Price asked. "My dear," Miss Marple replied in villages, "everything is connected." The locked door question that evening, Miss Marple requested to see the broken lock mechanism. Constable Briggs obliged. The key, slightly worn, fit snugly. "Was it always kept in the door?" she asked. "No, miss. Usually in Mr. Pettigrew's pocket, yet it was found beside him." "Yes." Miss Marple examined the key thoughtfully. "Curious. Why curious?" "Because," she said mildly, "one does not typically remove a key from a locked door after collapsing unless one has reason to." Constable Briggs stared. "You mean he locked it himself? Or someone wished us to think so?" A rising tension rumors thickened like autumn fog. Some whispered suicide. Others, scandal. The diocesan inspector postponed his visit. Captain Beresford pressed for swift resolution. Mrs. Harcourt grew sharper in tone. Miss Lane avoided the high street entirely. And through it all, Miss Marple walked gently, knitting in hand. her pale blue eyes absorbing every glance, every hesitation, every misplaced emphasis. For beneath the quiet grief of little Denscombe, something else stirred. Not merely a question of how a man died behind a locked door, but why. And Miss Marple, though she said little, had begun to see the faint outline of a pattern. A pattern stitched with pride, with fear, with concealment, and perhaps with love turned desperate. She paused one afternoon beside the churchyard yew tree, gazing thoughtfully at the vestry window. People, she murmured to herself, so often believe that locks protect them. Her needles clicked once more. But locks, said Miss Jane Marple softly, can also trap. And somewhere in little Denscombe, the truth waited quiet, patient, and perilously close to being revealed. Autumn settled over little Denscombe with a subtle insistence. The hedgerows deepened in colour, the evenings drew in more quickly, and a faint chill began to linger in the nave of St. Jude's long after the candles were extinguished. The village had resumed its routines, but not its ease. There are villages, Miss Marple often reflected, where a death becomes a story, and there are others where it becomes a silence. Little Denscombe had chosen silence, but silence, she knew, is rarely empty. A letter never sent. It was Mrs. Price who first brought Miss Marple the next small disturbance. "My dear Jane," she whispered over morning coffee, "they found something in Arthur's coat pocket." Miss Marple set down her toast with interest. A letter, unfinished, torn across the bottom. To whom? To the diocesan office. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened faintly. The letter, as later relayed by Constable Briggs, contained only a few lines. "I regret to inform you that there have been irregularities in parish disbursements. I feel it my duty," and there it ended. No signature, no specifics. But implication hung heavily in those few words. Irregularities, Captain Beresford repeated grimly when the matter was discussed at the vicarage that evening. Financial misconduct. Reverend Harcourt's face had grown noticeably paler. "This is outrageous," Mrs. Harcourt declared crisply. "Arthur handled accounts himself." "Precisely," said the captain. An uncomfortable stillness followed. Miss Marple observed each face in turn. Fear does not always look like guilt, she reflected, but guilt often resembles fear. The money question Constable Briggs began discreet inquiries into parish accounts. The missing ledger page became increasingly significant. "There's a discrepancy," he admitted reluctantly. A modest one, £50 unaccounted for. £50 was no trifling amount in a village parish. "Embezzlement," murmured Mrs. Price. "Or misdirection," Miss Marple suggested softly. She considered Mr. Pettigrew's careful habits. "A rigid man," Mrs. Harcourt had said. Rigid men, Miss Marple knew, do not typically misplace £50, but rigid men do sometimes discover unpleasant truths. A secret engagement. The next twist came from an unlikely source. Mrs. Merton, who ran the village post office and possessed an enviable talent for noticing envelopes, mentioned casually to Mrs. Price that Miss Beatrice Lane had recently received several letters bearing a London postmark. "Cream paper," Mrs. Merton confided. "Rather fine quality." Miss Marple listened with polite absorption. "Do you suppose," Mrs. Price ventured delicately, "that Miss Lane might have had attachments?" It transpired through gentle inquiry, rather than formal investigation, that Miss Lane had once been engaged to a medical student in London. The engagement had ended abruptly 5 years earlier. "He left quite suddenly," Mrs. Merton said with satisfaction. "There were rumours." "What sort of rumours?" Miss Marple inquired mildly. "That money had gone missing from the hospital dispensary." Miss Marple's knitting paused mid-stitch. "And Miss Lane?" "Oh," she returned here not long after. "Very quiet, kept to herself. Digitalis." A nurse. An engagement broken under financial suspicion. It was a compelling narrative. Perhaps too compelling. Captain Beresford's temper 3 days later. Raised voices were heard once more, this time from the vicarage garden. Captain Beresford and Reverend Harcourt stood facing one another, tension visible even from across the lane. "You should have told me," the captain was saying sharply. "There was nothing certain," the vicar replied. "Arthur was writing to the diocese. If there were irregularities, they must be addressed openly." Mrs. Harcourt appeared at the doorway, lips thin. "This is neither the time nor the place, Captain." Miss Marple, who had paused by the hedge with innocent deliberation, noted the vicar's hands trembling slightly. Later that afternoon, she remarked quietly to Mrs. Price. Men accustomed to command sometimes struggle when authority slips through their fingers. You suspect the captain? My dear Eleanor, Miss Marple said gently, I suspect human nature. The vestry window. It was on a blustery Wednesday that Miss Marple requested once more to see the vestry. Constable Briggs, by now half inclined to defer to her entirely, obliged. The narrow window overlooked the churchyard path. Leaves had gathered along the sill outside, as Marple studied them thoughtfully. Were these here on the morning of the harvest festival? I suppose so, said Briggs. It was windy the night before. Miss Marple bent slightly. One leaf appears lodged inside the latch. Briggs frowned. That's impossible. The window was shut. Precisely. The leaf, brittle and brown, had been caught between latch and frame. If the window had been opened after the wind died, Miss Marple said gently, one would not expect fresh leaves to enter. You mean? I mean, she replied calmly, that the window was opened at some point while the leaves were still blowing. But it was latched from inside when we broke in. Yes. Briggs stared at the narrow frame. It's too small for a grown man. Indeed. Silence deepened. A misleading medicine Dr. Mallory provided further complication. Digitalis was present, yes, he explained, but not in overwhelming quantity. It would have exacerbated a weak heart, not necessarily killed a healthy one outright. And was Mr. Pettigrew's heart weak? Asked Miss Marple. The doctor hesitated. There was mild enlargement, nothing dramatic, so the poison did not kill him alone? Not conclusively. Miss Marple nodded. Sometimes, she murmured, it is not the blow itself, but the fright preceding it. Mrs. Harcourt's composure cracks. The most dramatic development occurred 2 days later. Miss Marple, calling at the vicarage, found Mrs. Harcourt alone in the drawing-room. Her composure, so long immaculate, appeared strained. You have been asking questions, Mrs. Harcourt said abruptly. Only of the sort one asks in villages. You imply scandal. I imply nothing. Mrs. Harcourt's fingers tightened around the arm of her chair. Arthur Pettigrew was a difficult man. He delighted in obstruction. In what respect? He questioned my management of parish funds. He suggested I had misapplied charitable moneys. Had you? The question was delivered so mildly it might have been mistaken for idle curiosity. Mrs. Harcourt's eyes flashed. I reorganized certain disbursements temporarily. For efficiency? For the tower restoration? Miss Marple asked softly. A pause. That was Captain Beresford's proposal. But you supported it. Another silence. I will not be accused, Mrs. Harcourt said coldly. Miss Marple rose. No one has accused you, Mrs. Harcourt. But I find that when people defend themselves before being charged, it is often instructive. A night disturbance that same evening, an unexpected event unsettled the village further. The vestry was broken into. Or appeared to be. The temporary bolt had been forced. Papers scattered. The safe stood open. But nothing inside was missing. It's intimidation, Captain Beresford declared. Someone trying to destroy evidence. Or create it, Miss Marple suggested quietly. The safe, upon inspection, revealed something curious. Tucked within a ledger was a small envelope. Inside, a single page torn from the missing ledger section. The £50 discrepancy was circled in red pencil, and beneath it, written in Mr. Pettigrew's hand, to be discussed with S.H. immediately. S.H., murmured Briggs. Simon Harcourt, said the captain heavily. The vicar's face drained entirely of colour. This is preposterous. Miss Marple watched him closely. Fear, again. But was it guilt, or something more complicated? The stakes rise. The implication was now unmistakable. Mr. Pettigrew had intended to confront Reverend Harcourt regarding missing funds. He died before he could do so. Digitalis was present. The vestry door was locked. The window had been opened at some stage. And now, someone had staged a clumsy break-in. Little Denscombe's polite veneer was cracking. Suspicion shifted daily from Miss Lane to Mrs. Harcourt, from Captain Besford to the vicar himself. And beneath it all lay the riddle of the locked vestry. Miss Marple sat by Mrs. Price's hearth that night, her knitting resting idle in her lap. There is something very simple here, she said softly. Simple? Exclaimed Mrs. Price. Nothing about this is simple. Oh, but it is. Human motives are rarely elaborate. Only there. Disguises are. Then who? Miss Marple's pale blue eyes reflected the firelight. Someone, she said thoughtfully, who feared exposure more than consequence. Someone who understood locks and appearances, and someone who believed that if a door is locked, we shall cease to look for another exit. She resumed her knitting. But one must always look for the smallest opening, she added gently. Outside, the wind moved through the yew trees of St. Jude's churchyard, and somewhere, in the quiet heart of Little Denscombe, the truth waited very nearly within Miss Marple's grasp. The late October fog clung to Little Denscombe like a whispered secret. The village, cloaked in silver mist, was eerily silent save for the occasional cawing of crows and the distant tolling of St. Jude's bells. Inside the vicarage, Miss Marple sat quietly, her knitting in her lap, her eyes reflecting the soft lamplight, considering the tangled threads of motive, opportunity, and human nature. It had been nearly 2 weeks since Arthur Pettigrew's death, and during that time the village had been in a state of heightened observation. Windows were more frequently drawn, voices softer, and every polite greeting seemed to carry a hidden weight. Even the church appeared cautious, as though aware of its own vulnerability. Miss Marple had spent her time speaking discreetly to villagers, revisiting the vestry, and, most importantly, observing human behavior. Little Denscombe, she noted, was alive with small, telling details, the minutiae that often betrayed intention. Gathering the pieces, Miss Marple arranged her thoughts methodically, as one might with pieces of a puzzle. The locked vestry. The door had been locked from the inside, yet the key lay beside Pettigrew's hand. The window had been opened after the wind died, allowing leaves inside. Someone had wanted it to appear impossible to enter or exit the room. Digitalis, present, but not in an overwhelming quantity. It would have weakened Pettigrew's heart, making him susceptible to a sudden shock, but not alone fatal. The ledger and missing page. Pettigrew was investigating irregularities in parish funds. He intended to confront the vicar SH about £50 unaccounted for. The false break-in. The safe had been opened, papers scattered, but nothing taken. Someone had tried to create the appearance of forced entry. Potential suspects. Mrs. Harcourt, with her rigid control over parish affairs. Reverend Harcourt, nervous under scrutiny. Captain Beresford, ambitious about restoration projects. Miss Lane, with her medical knowledge, and of course, Mrs. Price, quiet but observant. Miss Marple's mind worked through the possibilities. Each suspect had motive, but opportunity and subtlety were crucial, and someone had acted with precision, not brute force. Observing behavior, Miss Marple returned to St. Jude's on a crisp morning to watch interactions. The churchyard, misted and empty, allowed her clear observation of human patterns. She noted that Captain Beresford's visits had become increasingly urgent, always asking after parish accounts. Mrs. Harcourt remained immaculately composed, but unusually watchful. Miss Lane avoided confrontation and spoke little of herself. The vicar, meanwhile, had retreated to his study, brow furrowed, appearing distracted and uneasy. Miss Marple's attention, however, was drawn to the vestry itself. She examined the narrow window carefully, noticing the slight scuff on the latch and the smudge of dirt on the inner sill. A small, seemingly insignificant detail, yet enough to suggest that the window had indeed been used as an entry or exit point. The confrontation. Miss Marple invited the key players to the vicarage one evening under the pretense of discussing the harvest festival arrangements. All arrived, curious and apprehensive, unaware that the final threads of the mystery were about to be drawn together. She began with gentle, conversational remarks, gradually guiding attention to the vestry. The vestry, as you know, was locked from the inside, she said, knitting needles clicking softly. And yet, leaves were found inside the window, which could only have entered after it was opened. There was a small amount of digitalis in Mr. Pettigrew's system, enough to weaken but not kill a man of strong constitution. And someone staged a break-in after his death. The assembly remained quiet, each absorbing the observation. Miss Marple looked directly at Mrs. Harcourt. Miss Harcourt, you were anxious about Mr. Pettigrew examining the accounts. Mrs. Harcourt's lips tightened. I merely wanted to maintain order. And Captain Beresford, Miss Marple continued. You were keen on the tower restoration, and the funds in question could have impeded your plans. The captain's brow darkened. Miss Lane, Miss Marple said softly, you had knowledge of digitalis, a nurse's experience, and a close presence to the vestry on that day. Miss Lane shifted uncomfortably. Yet none of these, Miss Marple said, her voice calm. "We're both willing and clever enough to stage the locked door, administer a weak dose, and create the illusion of a break-in." She paused, letting the room absorb the statement. The person responsible must have been someone intimately familiar with the vestry itself, with its key, its habits, and its small vulnerabilities. All eyes turned expectantly toward the vicar. "Simon," Mrs. Harcourt whispered. Miss Marple's gaze softened. "Reverend Harcourt, you believe that if Mr. Pettigrew discovered the irregularities, it would jeopardize not only your position but your wife's carefully maintained order. You entered the vestry, intending only to frighten him, perhaps lock him in momentarily, but you did not anticipate his heart would fail." The vicar's face was ashen. "Jane, it was only, Miss Marple interrupted gently, a momentary lapse in judgment that proved fatal. She continued, "You had the opportunity, the knowledge of the key's location, and the understanding of how to stage the scene. The digitalis was meant to weaken, not kill, and the staged break-in ensured appearances would mislead. And yet, small clues, the leaf in the latch, the position of the key, the scattered ledger page revealed the truth." Silence filled the room. Even Mrs. Price's usually steady composure was shaken. The vicar lowered his eyes, voice barely audible. "I never meant." Miss Marple nodded. "Intent and outcome do not always align, Simon. But clarity is what we need now." The chill of early November had settled over Little Denscombe, yet inside the vicarage and St. Jude's Church, warmth and resolution was slowly returning. The villagers, though still whispering behind lace curtains, could at last breathe, for the shadow of suspicion had been illuminated. And at the heart of this revelation was Miss Jane Marple, knitting needles resting calmly in her lap, her pale blue eyes sharp, with the quiet authority of one who understands human nature intimately. Restoring order the following morning, Miss Marple accompanied Mrs. Price to St. Jude's to inspect the vestry once more. The broken lock had been repaired, the scattered papers carefully restored, and the small silver communion cup polished until it shone like morning sunlight on the flagstones. Mrs. Price sighed. "It feels peaceful again, .net," Miss Marple replied softly. "But we are approaching peace. Villagers need reassurance more than explanations. The truth, however, must always be known eventually." Captain Beresford had volunteered to supervise repairs to the vestry, and even Mrs. Harcourt, though reserved, seemed reconciled to the events. The vicar himself had been quietly removed from direct oversight of the parish accounts until an external audit could be arranged, a precaution both reasonable and discreet. Miss Marple observed each participant carefully, noting subtle gestures and expressions. Fear and anxiety lingered, but remorse and understanding had begun to take their place. The confrontation concluded the evening prior. Miss Marple had invited the key individuals to the vicarage drawing room once more. This time, the mood was calmer, more deliberate. Reverend Harcourt, still pale, had accepted responsibility for his actions, acknowledging that fear of discovery had driven him to overreach. "I only wish to protect my parish," he admitted quietly, "and my wife's reputation. I never imagined poor Arthur's heart would fail." Miss Marple nodded gently. "Intent does not always align with outcome, Simon. You acted out of fear, but the evidence, small though it was, spoke clearly. Human nature is never hidden entirely, and the smallest inconsistency often reveals the truth." Mrs. Harcourt, seated with hands folded neatly on her lap, remained silent, though her eyes reflected understanding and relief. Even Captain Beresford allowed himself a subtle exhale, apparently satisfied that the mystery had been resolved without scandal. The village responds by mid-morning. The news had quietly spread. The cause of Mr. Pettigrew's death had been clarified, and the mystery of the locked vestry explained. The villagers received this revelation with the mixture of astonishment and relief, typical of English country life. Gossip softened into polite observation, curiosity became restrained, and the hum of daily routines resumed. The church service the following Sunday was imbued with renewed solemnity. Villagers arrived with a quiet reverence, whispering occasionally about prudence, human frailty, and the unexpected ways secrets can manifest. Miss Marple observed it all from the back pew, nicking softly, her eyes noting each small gesture, a hand gently laid on a shoulder, a furtive glance exchanged between friends, a child craning to see the choir. Life, she reflected, resumed its quiet rhythms even after disruption. Miss Marple's reflections later. Over tea with Mrs. Price, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Little Denscombe is much like its vestry, she mused. Orderly, secure, familiar, yet even in the safest places, a hidden worry can fester. A door may be locked, a window latched, a key misplaced, and still, the truth will find its way, if one only watches carefully. Mrs. Price smiled. You never cease to observe, Jane. Do you ever tire of seeing through people? Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes glinting with gentle wit. Oh, not at all. People reveal themselves in the smallest gestures. A nervous cough, a hesitant glance, or even the way they hold a teacup, and it is the careful observer who pieces together the puzzle. And you always manage to do so with kindness, Mrs. Price said softly. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked. Kindness is, after all, the only way to navigate human folly without becoming harsh oneself. One must distinguish between errors of fear and errors of malice. The village returns to calm by November's end. Little Denscombe had returned to its familiar routines. Harvest decorations were packed away, pews polished, and parish accounts carefully audited by external officials. Miss Lane resumed her organ practice without anxiety. Captain Beresford's restoration plans proceeded within proper oversight. Mrs. Harcourt restored order to the parish office with discreet precision. And through it all, Miss Marple observed quietly, content in the knowledge that while human nature could be perplexing and sometimes dangerous, understanding and gentle scrutiny often provided a resolution far more effective than anger or suspicion. As she packed her bag to return to St. Mary Mead, she paused once more by the yew trees of St. Jude's Church. The vestry window, now firmly latched, reflected the soft winter sun. Locks and keys, she murmured to herself, are not merely physical barriers. They are symbols of trust and fear, of human frailty and intention. And in the end, it is observation, patience, and little wit that reveals the truth. She smiled faintly, tucked her knitting back into her bag, and walked down the village path. The small village, its secrets laid bare yet reconciled, exhaled a quiet, steady breath. Life would continue, orderly and peaceful once more, under the watchful, gentle gaze of Miss Jane Marple.